If you go back in history, and unfortunately I'm old enough to see all these titanic shifts in technology from like the mainframe to the client server, and then the whole .com era, and then the movement to software as a service. Think of the impact of AI. It's just, on jobs, on people, on writing college essays, on whatever. It's really almost a phenomenon that's going to impact so many people, if not everybody. The other critical difference between some of those other titanic shifts is this one is going to be probably the biggest shift, and it's going to happen very quickly, right? So that's why a lot of people are very nervous. Is AI going to put me out of business?
Welcome to another episode of Hold the Churn, the show where we go behind the scenes with the sharpest minds in revenue to decode what's changing, what's timeless, and what actually drives growth in 2025 and beyond. I'm Chandrika, co-founder of Quibly AI, an AI-powered account intelligence platform. Our AI agents help post-sales teams identify and act on signals to expand and retain existing customers. My guest today is one of enterprise software's most seasoned revenue leaders. Paul Melchiorre helped scale Anaplan through its 2018 IPO as Global Customer Officer and CRO after senior leadership roles at SAP and Ariba. He's now an operating partner at Stripes. He chairs the boards at R3 and has co-authored Selling the Cloud. Paul, welcome to Hold the Churn.
Thank you, Chandrika. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm very, very excited for this.
Well, Paul, can you get us started by giving the listeners a quick introduction?
Yeah, so that was a pretty good background. I've been in enterprise software, I think, since, right out of college. I went to go work at ADP, then was selling hardware for a while. And then, I was very lucky. Sometimes I think it's really important to be in the right place at the right time to have the kind of career and have success. And, when nobody knew who SAP was back in the late 80s, early 90s. I'm dating myself, obviously, but they picked Philadelphia, my hometown, as the North American base. And so I was one of the first less than 100 employees in the US, and maybe I think globally it was a little over 1,000. Now I think SAP is a small country, right? It's a big company, and being able to watch that growth and be one of the first sales reps, move into sales management, run all of North America, it was a great experience in the right place at the right time. And then I wanted to take a chance at a startup. So literally packed up, moved from the East Coast, went to California, did my first tour of duty in Silicon Valley to help start up Ariba. And I was out there for 4 years. The first 3 years was the funnest time of my life. And then last year was the worst year of my life. If you followed the internet boom, it went from, an incredible, start to go to, I think it was 40 billion plus of market cap. And then over a weekend, it was down to 4 billion. It was pretty hectic times for sure. And then was there as we sold SAP ironically, and then did some vertical SaaS at iPipeline. And in Philly, it was a insurance company. And then had the opportunity to go to Anaplan and, fortunate enough to take them public. And now I'm selling money.
That's incredible. I'm sure you have so many stories, Paul, that the listeners want to hear. So let's dive right in. You've led teams at SAP, Anaplan. You've served on boards like DocuSign, R3, Dataiku. What core principles for building and scaling revenue teams have you seen consistently work across organizations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple answer to this because everybody's got a playbook, right? Everybody's got a process. And, I feel that's important. You have to have a process, a playbook, something going in of structure and framework. And there's plenty of them that you can lean on, and, we're not out to reinvent. But what I've always found in going from like a small, mid-sized kind of, early stage company to scaling to, becoming public, et cetera. A lot of it is getting the right people at the right time. So, and obviously the company with the best people typically wins. And if you look today now, companies like Google and Facebook are paying $100 million signing bonus like Steph Curry, LeBron James. But no, it's for some AI programmer. So I tell my daughter, that's what you want to be. You want to be that person who gets $100 million signing bonus from Zuckerberg or, whatever. But, the reality is the best people do make a difference, and it's the best people at the right time. So I see a lot of mistakes in what companies make today is they overhire too early, right? So in the early stages, you really need, especially on the go-to-market side, the rainmakers, people who can roll their sleeves up, get big deals done, be creative, have the EQ to figure it out, especially if you're in an early stage or an early adopting market where you have to be the evangelist and get the early adopters to buy in. So I think having those kinds of people at the early stage, and then also being able, the biggest principle, which is hard, because the people who get you from maybe, let's make up numbers, 10 to 50 million in revenue, probably are not the ones that get you from 50 to 500, if that makes sense, right? So a lot of times some people do grow into those roles, and that's fantastic because you want to keep people from within and promote from within. But most of the time you do have to then start thinking, okay, it's time for this particular position at this stage, especially in the go-to-market. Maybe you need a global sales leader who has international experience, needs somebody who's, worked in enterprise versus, say, small, mid-size, or mid-market. So you do need to make those adjustments. The same way you change your culture as a company grows, you do have to change those personnel. So I think being open to those kind of adjustments as you grow, getting the right people, obviously, and timing, having the right people in the right positions at the right time on the field, if you will. They've kind of been the boring core principles. If you do that right, chances are, you're going to probably have some success.
Yeah. And you touch on such an important subject here, Paul. So say you're the CRO at a company that's in the range of $1 million to $5 million in ARR right now. What's the minimum viable GTM org in your opinion? And what would be sort of the first 3 hires you would make?
Yeah, first of all, I think the CRO role is not for companies 1 to 5, right? Because you don't have enough else to be worried about other than to get those first 20 deals. And I think that's another big mistake to follow on is if let's say you're the first go-to-market sales leader at the company from 1 to 5, right? And there you want to make sure, your first hires are people who can sell, right? Because you're not going to be managing a lot. You're really going to get the first, say, dozen to 2 dozen lighthouse accounts or customers to get you to product market fit. And I think I see a lot of people, sometimes they overhire, they bring in the SAP person at that 1 to 5 and they expect the assistant to do everything, or the SDR group. Well, we don't have an SDR group, right? You got to dial for dollars. And I've always said, in these early stages, you need to bring in very strong sales folks who can build their own pipeline. Because if you're relying on other folks to build pipeline at that early stage, it's depending on the products, obviously, but in typical software, enterprise software especially, you really need to have people who have a Rolodex, a network, an ability to get the right people on the phone or through email or whatever the mechanism is, or wait in the lobby for them to show up if they actually go to an office, whatever it takes. And so I think those first couple of hires need to be those more experienced salespeople. If it's in a vertical market, then you probably want to be sure that someone has sold to that persona before, right? Or they're from that industry. The training has to, because there is no enablement in that early stage. And then the probably the most important hire behind that is the best pre-sales people, whether you call them solution engineers, technical support, whatever, because they're the consultants, if you will, that the customers are going to be looking to you as an organization. This is the person I'm trusting. The salespeople are good, but that, pre-sales engineer, solution architect, whatever the term is, to me is probably one of the most important roles in scaling a company, because a great pre-sales leader and group can make mediocre salespeople look really good.
That's right. Well, what's a common mistake you see a lot of founders making at these early stages besides what you just talked about, which is, hiring very experienced people too early, who may not be the right people or the best fit for this stage? What's another mistake that if you were to guide some founders, you would ask them to avoid?
I talk to founders all the time about this because there's a stage in a company I call founder-led sales, right? Just like you as a founder, you're doing the first deals. There's no doubt about it, right? And that's awesome. However, a lot of founders feel that they got to continue in that role. And typically a lot of founders in our portfolio as well, they're more technical founders. Not a lot of salespeople starting companies up. Some do, but for the most part, it's typically a product person, a technical person, a visionary marketing person that's, came up with the idea for the company and got it started and then went into their network or, went to as many companies to show them this great idea. And then all of a sudden it's like starting to scale and they think they're the ones to scale it. And that's a problem, right? Or they bring in a weaker sales person because they don't want to give up power or be challenged. Seen that as well. So I think that to me is one of the bigger challenges in going from founder-led sales to really scalable go-to-market. You got to bring those people around you. And I remember early at Ariba, one of the sayings, and there was a ton of early stage sayings back then. That's a separate book. That was crazy times, but it was like, okay, I want to hire people better than me. Because I remember managers and their founders that will be like, I don't want to hire any smarter than me. I want to be the smartest person in the room because look, I found this company. And I think when you go from founder-led to handing it off, that handoff is so important. So they have to, whoever the founder is, like yourself, you've got to pick a really trusted go-to-market partner, right, to be side by side with. And then you got to feel comfortable because as the company grows, the product pivots, the product market fit may change, price, all these other things that as a CEO and founder, you need to be paying attention to. You can't do that job and lead sales. So, I always say, you could do one job okay, probably really good. Two jobs, you're probably doing two jobs poorly, right? And so I think that's where I say in that transition, getting that founder-led motion and handing it off in the proper way to a partner who's going to really take it to the next step where you can work hand in hand with that partner. And unfortunately, a lot of founders hold on too long.
Yeah. No, I think there's a saying that I feel like a lot of people have read, which is as a CEO, your job is to maintain two things for sure. One is have cash in the bank. Two, hire the right people and then step out of their way. And I think that's such an important point that a lot of founders, sometimes knowingly or unknowingly sort of fall prey to where they want to keep control, they want to maintain control or feel like if they hire somebody better, it's not the, best look for them. But what I've seen is the most successful companies are built by people who know where their gaps are and actually hire to complement their strengths.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's no doubt about it. It's probably the biggest mistake a lot of founders make is not letting go and trying to control everything because it's a big inhibitor to scaling and success. And the ones who have figured it out, and there's very few who have built large companies like the Bezoses and the Ellisons that have stayed through the process. That's more the exception than the rule. But even, in some of the most successful companies like the Googles and the Facebooks, Metas, they brought in incredible lieutenants, if you will, to help run those companies and drive the growth. You got to, it's a team sport, so you can't do it by yourself.
Yeah. Now, speaking of companies like Google, Facebook, or ones that have reached scale, I'm curious to hear how did Anaplan's revenue org change from pre-IPO to post-IPO? What were some of the key things that you had to steer in the right direction as the company transitioned from being private to now open to public markets?
Yeah, I think it's actually even before that. So when I got there, it was about 30, 40 million in revenue and a profile we were selling to and how we were selling, how we were going to market, the organization, it was very, very different. And I was there maybe 3 months and then they fired the CEO, which I did not sign up for a CEO job. If I was going to do that, I would have did that 15, 20 years ago. But myself and the CFO were thrown into the, position to get the company to a less cash burn. So it was very difficult. We had to take out a lot of employees based upon the revenue we had. And then I just felt the sales profile, the type of people we had hired were more product salespeople that came out of SAP, Oracle, IBM, and that relied on kind of the global account execs to sell planning or their planning products, where now we were the new starting company coming in to unseat them. You needed to deal with procurement and run a process. And honestly, a lot of the folks that we had were more salespeople at very large companies that were accustomed to having a lot of support, right? And so out of the 30 reps, I inherited, I think 11 remained. And they were great ones. So I had a great core group. And then we brought in a whole new group. And then I talked about the value of the pre-sales organization because it was a complicated product. You had to build your own models, and we didn't really have a partner ecosystem. So we had to bring in really good pre-sales leadership and folks. I pulled a good friend of mine out of Ariba that I had known and worked with, Todd. He was amazing in building that infrastructure for pre-sales and pre-sales support to support a growing sales organization. So we went from like 30 down to 12 and then up to like 130 in the 2 years period. And so obviously a lot of things changed, but we wanted to make sure we kept the metrics and all that to be able to go public. Because to go public, you have to trim a lot of the stuff around the edges. In fact, before we went on stage, we talked about the sales stack of technology. And I'll never forget, once they fired the CEO, I started looking at where we could save money. And I realized we had all these subscriptions. Like LinkedIn was the best example. We had Navigator had first come out. We had 175 licenses in Navigator. So I said, why don't we just turn it off and see what happens? So we turned it off. 3 people called me and said, hey, where's my LinkedIn Navigator? I said, you know what? Put it on your expense report. You can buy it. We'll pay for it. Obviously, you figured out how to use it. But the other 172 people we're paying for have never turned it on. So we did a lot of that kind of consolidating. So the org got what I'll call as efficient as possible because, you start measuring things like CAC and all of these measurements to be able to go public. And so I felt we did all that in a really positive way. And then I think we kind of went a little astray. I went into a different role. We brought in a global CRO to kind of do some additional things. We're expanding to go public. And I really didn't want to stay at the company past my 4-year time period, especially because I was doing the CEO stuff before the CRO. And so I said, I got about another year. Let's bring somebody in. We did. And then I think when we went public, we had all this funds and, we kind of just spent it was that 2020, 21 COVID, this great successful IPO. And I think we kind of got a little lazy. Our ratios got bloated. We had a lot of subject matter experts, which are great, but you can't have too many of them because they don't have quota. They're just an added cost. Our consulting group grew. And, although I think we did a really good job of offloading a lot of the support infrastructure to partners, which also helped our go-to-market, we just had too many support components for the amount of quota carrying reps that we had. And that hurt us in a big way with our valuation. And eventually Tomo Bravo bought the company, fortunately, right before the market crashed. Like I said, you got to be lucky than good sometimes. They wiped out about 35-40% of the go-to-market the day the check cleared. So it does change from pre to post and onwards. At the end of the day, it's really efficiency in go-to-market because you're always going to be measured on, how you're growing and how successfully you're growing, with your cost in mind.
Yeah. What are some metrics, since you touched on metrics, what are some metrics that are your favorite for measuring efficiency of the go-to-market org?
Yeah, I think sales effectivity, CAC, which is sales and marketing, are kind of the standard ones that I look at. I look also at employee turnover in the quota carrying reps and in, the go-to-market organization, because if that's too high, then your ramp time, which is another obvious measurement that's important. And look, ramp in some complex, situations, like, it's going to be 6 months if you're selling multi-million-dollar transactions in the enterprise. But you need to make sure, are you minimizing the ramp time by better enablement? Those are some of the metrics that matter. And then putting the right resource in. Because if I could reduce ramp time, say from 6 months to 4 months, that it automatically increases my sales effectivity and efficiency. Obviously, I could always raise my price, but that's a lot harder to do than reality, right? There's a market that's telling you probably what your pricing is. So what are your average sales price based on the market? It continues to go up. That means you're selling more value, doing bigger deals. And then one of the ones I used to call the happy rep percentage, which is kind of a weird one, but a lot of times in companies, especially as you're early stage, a small number of people are doing all the deals. And so if you look, you got, you hit 100% of the number. That's great. But you did it with 20% of the reps. So 80% of reps are really pissed off, not happy. They're going to leave. So you're going to have high turnover, et cetera. So if you could get like 75% of your reps to be at 75 plus or more of quota, right? So you're going to have the big top performers to put you over the top. But if you can get a majority or a large majority of the reps to be close to quota, so that's why I used to do the 75, then at least there's a metric, you got an overall stable organization. It's not perfect, but at least you're not going to have big churn, and maybe you have to adjust the quotas, you have to tweak the territories, because I think there are also metrics that do matter as well. I think there are metrics that matter. Sales has become a lot more scientific now than back in my early days where it was just, we didn't have CRM. It was all a spreadsheet and you winged it. So today I think you have to be measuring the metrics that matter.
Yeah. No, it really has become more scientific. And I think personally, I think it's for the better. And you see where the gaps are and you go attack those specific areas. So let's get into the mechanics of a deal, Paul. Let's get into how an enterprise deal is actually done. So give us an example of a deal you're really proud of, how you orchestrated, exec alignment, risk, value quantification, everything that went into it.
Yeah, in fact, it's probably the last deal I did before I kind of was just about to be out of Anaplan. And the rep is this gal, Melissa. She's actually in my book because she just was so good and so strategic. And I talk about exec alignment, so important because typically, especially you get into these large organizations that, and this is one of the large organizations you mentioned earlier. It was the largest deal in the company's history. It was, I think, 9 million ARR deal. So that's a lot of money for one customer for 1 year. And it was a 5-year deal. So it was huge for us. And, we knew we had some complexities. They wanted us to run on the platform. So we didn't really have the ability to run on the platform. And there was a 16-page security thing that we were deficient in to run on their platform. So it was like, okay, well, we had our own data centers and we used Amazon as a backup. And so obviously these guys wanted us to be on their cloud. So we said, okay, sure, we'll do it. And of course we knew we were going to be a while to do it. So that was one of the complexities. So we had a lot of extra groups that had to get involved. It wasn't just finance and the folks on the sales side, the 2 use cases. Now we had all the IT folks overlooking this, and they're a big SAP shop. They're like, well, just wait for SAP that's included. But they knew they needed something between now and when SAP is going to come out with them. In fact, I think to this day, they still haven't moved to SAP planning. But it was great because at the end of the day, exec alignment is so critical. And the big mistake people make is they're like, okay, I want my janitor to meet your CEO. Well, that's usually not good to be doing that. And it's nothing against janitors, but you cannot have the lower level users working with the executives. You have to map that before time. And I think what she did very, very well is, as I was the head of sales, she was the rep, we would not allow them, to talk to the CEO. And we said, look, we're not doing that. And I said, look, if Ruth wants to meet with our CEO, I could set that up, or we can meet with her. It's whatever you want to do, but we're not going to have you meet with them. Nothing personal. It's hard to do because when you got a $9 million deal on the line, you got to have a little bit of, bravery. And Melissa had tons of that. I was afraid of no, let's just cave, and she's like, no, we're not caving. And so that's one of probably the last transaction I did. I did 1 or 2 other smaller, less strategic. That was the biggest deal at the time, I think still is in the company's history, and the way we kind of orchestrated it. And it probably took an extra month and a half to get done because they wanted to do it. We kind of held off, and so we got the maximum value, the maximum price. And, we did the exec alignment at the right time, at the right place. And I think that made all the difference.
Wow. That's a super interesting one because, a lot of folks who are listening are probably in the earlier phases where they're not doing the $9 million deals right now. But as we get there, things become more and more complex. And so you talked a little bit about value and pricing, Paul. Let's dig in a little bit deeper. What's your playbook for testing, pricing, packaging without really blowing up quarters?
Yeah, obviously you got to do it the right time and place at a dead time or whatever when you're going to change pricing. Or if you're going to test things, test it at the quarter to try to bring deals in either earlier or, to send somebody who's maybe next quarter's deal into this quarter. And, so you do have to do a little testing. I think there's a lot of complexity to pricing and you got to really be, overly thoughtful of the impacts. And what we would always do, we'd always kind of put like a little pricing committee together, get some reps who really understand, get customers, right? How, and talk to procurement at your customers, because a lot of times, oh, well, this pricing's easy. Well, if it's complicated and the procurement folks can't figure it out, or they can't measure it, or they can't do compliance on the pricing, then it doesn't matter if it's free. It's like, oh, I can't understand this pricing. So include the kind of constituents, the people who matter in the pricing process, obviously the buyer, the procurement organization at companies, and see how they're going to respond to the pricing. So I always say, A, it should be related to something that you can tie to value. So at Ariba, it was actually kind of cool because we said, okay, the amount of spend that goes through the system really is going to determine how much the price is. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? Well, because if you're putting $1 billion of spend through the system, on average, you're saving 10%. It's procurement, right? It's been the rule for the more you can control, you could save at least 10%. If you're a bad procurement organization, you could save 10%. So we go in and say, look, we can capture $1 billion of spend, and the worst procurement organizations, it's going to be, $1 billion or $100 million. So that's a big number. Now they're not going to pay you $100 million, but that's the way to get the value. So it was based upon a value metric, and then it has to be something you can easily measure, like Workday. It's based on the number of employees. That's a pretty easy thing to figure out. You go on the this 10K, it usually says how many employees you have. So, and I think you're seeing now pricing evolve into different types of consumption models and other types, value-based models, especially in healthcare, outcome-based, which I think is great. It's difficult and complex, but I think people are going to have to think now, okay, I can't just do it based on how many users or maybe how many employees or some kind of easy to determine generic metric. Because as you move into like kind of the electricity model, how much you use, how much you pay for, or how much I get out of it is how much I'm going to pay. Customers like that, right? You don't want to pay more for your electric bill if you're not using it, right? And so we have to evolve the pricing models. But I think doing it in a collaborative way. We actually had Bain come in and help us as we migrated off from Anaplan from a kind of a user base only, because people were saying, oh, I don't want to spend all that on the users, and we weren't getting adoption. Right. So we're like, we got to make the users cheaper so that people, want to adopt. And then maybe we can get them on another metric that, equals the value. And that's what we did.
Yeah. Well, so as these pricing models are evolving, Paul, most of the companies are now earning a portion of their revenue, if not all of it, after the sale is done. It's not earned upfront at the time of sale. A lot of it is earned by driving consumption of the product, by driving outcomes for the customers.
Mm-hmm.
So the post sales really, and I'm not a big fan of the word or the phrase post sales, because in my opinion, like the sale never ends really, right? You are continuing to prove value to the customer. But in the traditional form, the post sales part of the revenue lifecycle becomes so critical. What are your thoughts on how should companies think about tailoring that part of the revenue lifecycle to continue showing value to customers?
You totally changed now. It's really driving, and I talked about the value of the pre-sales solution engineers. They're almost becoming more valuable in the sales cycle than the sales rep, right? And customer success, obviously, to drive enablement and things like that. But if you look at some of these big, whether it's the Snowflakes or the Databricks that are doing these huge consumption deals, they kind of started it. And what's happening is you sign up for a certain, basket of consumption. And now all of a sudden, the pre-sales folks have to go in, solution engineers find opportunities, find use cases, build value within certain use cases across the enterprise to get that consumption. It's completely upside down from the early SAP days where we'd sign the multi-million-dollar deal, and as soon as the ink dried, we pulled the fire alarm and ran out, went and tried to get the next one, and then whoever else came in, whether it was Deloitte or Accenture or whoever, let them worry about it, and the service folks, it was kind of literally the throw it over the fence to implementation and get out. Yeah, unfortunately, those days are over, and it's a lot harder. So the consumption-based models are really driving a much more, stringent approach around enablement value creation after the contract or buying agreement is signed, because the technical people know, the business people know this is what I want to buy, but they don't know all the ways they can use it in their organization. And therefore, it's important for the solution architects to come in, architect these solutions, get the enablement, get the value, and make sure customer success keeps them going so you don't churn. So it's almost a 180-degree difference than most of my career.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about Anaplan, and Anaplan, you had adoption as one of the areas that you were focused on, when you were moving away from a pure just user-based pricing. So, Paul, from your perspective as a leader who typically has like a 10,000 feet view into everything that's going on, what are things you use to diagnose whether, adoption is at the level it should be and customers are continuing to use the product, because that's how then Anaplan would make money?
Yeah, and a lot of times our model was land and expand, which is a very popular, selling motion today, because people don't want to make the big investment up front. They'll use it for this particular use case, and if it really works well, maybe other folks will use it, or you'll get full expansion, within a finance organization or supply chain, whichever. So you really do need to pay attention afterwards, as we just spoke. But I think from the view of where you see and we used to do it as simple as red, yellow, and green, where we'd say, okay, green, everything's good, the numbers are good, the usage, and most products should be able to detect levels of usage. And it's just not how many seats you have, how many live seats are up and running based on what they spent. Maybe they bought 100 seats, but only 30 people are up and running. That maybe isn't good. Well, maybe they bought 100 seats and 100 people are logged in, but only 30% are really using it, So there's different metrics that you can look at from a high level that can determine usage, adoption, how much are they actually in and using the product. Second is, I always was a proponent of quarterly executive, even if it was a 10-minute Zoom or call, if you do proper executive alignment, like we talked about earlier, right, and you're aligned at the proper executive level, it's very easy for you to pick up the phone. Sandrika, how's it going over there? I noticed maybe usage is down a little bit. Have you heard anything at your 30,000 foot level? Yeah, as a matter of fact, everybody's complaining now, and we're actually looking at something else. What? Nobody else knew that. And then maybe you have that executive call, and then you maybe can come in and fix it, right? So, those quarterly or whatever the cadence is in the business to keep because a lot of times you lose business not because people aren't using it or don't like it or they don't think there's value, but the executive sponsor's gone and a new one comes in and they use your competitor's product at their old company. And the first thing they want to do is get that old company out, and you're out. And so it's like exec alignment is also critical, in addition to the typical churn metrics that we look at for red, yellow, green. Like we talked about earlier, can't have a leaky bucket, or some people call it, because if you get great new business and you're expanding that new business, but you're losing out the other side, it's like it's the hamster wheel. So it's so hard to get new business. You want to make sure you keep that customer for life. And that's the value of a SaaS model, is the expectation is that you're going to continue to have that customer. And if you churn, it's probably one of the most important metrics now today is the retention metrics that people look at. And so if you don't have a good handle on that, you don't have a good infrastructure within customer success, strong solution engineers to build those use cases, you're going to have a churn problem.
Yeah. Well, in this sort of post-sales world, Paul, where retention is something that a lot of folks are now paying attention to for a number of reasons, the macro environment, the pressure that you're seeing. And ultimately, I think the new business at some point is finite. It's capped. Like you cannot create new companies, new customers out of thin air. At some point, it caps out. So, you're absolutely right. There's so much value in paying attention to whether customers are happy, picking up the phone and talking to executives. Let's talk about the role of AI in all of that. Everyone's favorite topic. AI has so much promise that, companies are talking about, companies are excited about. Some of it is being realized already. Some of it is a little bit farther out. What do you see from your vantage point of, one, having worked at a lot of these companies before, pre-AI era, and now talking to a lot of founders and working with companies being on boards where AI is, I'm sure, a hot topic that's being discussed often and regularly. So yeah, what are you seeing in the AI world?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, if you go back in history, and unfortunately I'm old enough to see all these titanic shifts in technology from like the mainframe to the client server, and then the whole .com era, and then the movement to software as a service and delivery through Amazon and Microsoft and Google Clouds. And now we're in this kind of, impact that impacts everybody. I mean, think of the impact of AI. It's just, on jobs, on people, on writing college essays, on whatever. It's really almost a phenomenon that's going to impact so many people, if not everybody. The other, I think, critical difference between some of those other titanic shifts is this one is going to be probably the biggest shift, and it's going to happen very quickly, right? So that's why a lot of people are very nervous. AI going to put me out of business? Is it going to disintermediate me? Is it, whatever. If I'm a big Fortune consumer packaged goods company, how do I leverage AI? Because if my competitor leverages it better, they're going to have better insights or whatever and lower cost structures. And I'm going to, come in second, third, or fourth. So it's impactful everywhere, right? It's also at the height of the hype cycle, which as salespeople we love, right? Because it's, you got to buy this because everybody else is buying it, right? And so that part is good. The macro tailwinds with AI is definitely fueling a lot of folks to come to the buying table and make sure they at least have an AI strategy, B, some, capabilities that they're building in, whether internally to save costs or externally to generate more revenue. And so I think from that perspective, whether you're a Fortune 1 or a small startup, you better be thinking about it because it's not going away. I think from the standpoint of my view as an investor, right? Because now in the last 4 or 5 years at Stripes, I've been selling money instead of software. It's a very different perspective sitting on the boards, working with the founders. And we're almost saying now, forget about your AI strategy. You have to be AI native. You have to be AI first. And then how do you build the moat around your company? Because if everybody's got the AI, everybody got the same tools, then what is it that you're doing differently to basically build that moat around your company? Whether it's the unique use case that you're providing a solution that's very valuable for, your time to market to get AI production ready and moving and scalable in the company. And then I think also whether it's a vertical or use case specific capability, because you have unique data sets that you can build models on. So I think first of all, it's a great time to be in the business. I think this is the big resurgence of Silicon Valley because it was kind of dead for a little bit. Nobody's going into the office. Everybody's leaving San Francisco, going to Austin, Boston, everywhere else. But we're just seeing so much of a concentration of talent and AI talent in the Valley, building just incredible companies in months, or less than a year. And it's just, that's just a different phenomenon. And you better be ready for it and you better be strapped in because if you're not ready for a wild ride, you're going to be left behind very quickly.
Yeah. Well said, Paul. I mean, we used to talk about AI is the future, but AI is the present, and it's being built here right now in Silicon Valley. Yeah, amen to that. Well, I want to close out the conversation, Paul, by talking a little bit about your book. You wrote a book. Yes, let's show it to the listeners. You wrote a book, Selling the Cloud. So I want to talk about a couple of things in there. One, let's start with what are top 3 tips from the leaders you interviewed as part of writing this book that you've seen actually move revenue?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it was such a great, fun experience talking to, really for Mark and myself, my co-author, we said, okay, we have all this experience, but we know so many people that can bring value to this because, now we take our experience and we times it by 12. Right. And we brought these experts or titans, we called them in, and they just had such a great perspective in each of these areas. If I think the one that I loved the most was empathy. I think it was chapter 3, right? So, and I would always say, and I have 3 daughters, so I'm obviously very partial. I always said, why are women better salespeople than men? And everybody look at me, what are you talking about? Well, I'm like, listen, if anything's equal, I'm hiring the ladies. Why? And I'd never really understood why. But all through my career, whether it be at SAP, at Ariba, at Anaplan, we had some of the top reps who were always female. And I'm like, what is it that they're doing differently that men don't do? So we started looking at that, and it was really empathy. You think about if you're selling to a customer, sometimes you're caring about yourself. You need the commission to pay for your new car or whatever, or your rent. And that's not empathy. That's, selfishness, the opposite. And I think having empathy, the customers feel that. They see it. And that was, to me, one of the biggest impacts. And it's hard to do, right? Because you have to almost feel their pain. And, I always thought that women were just better at that and they could multitask. I've not met any men, I know I'm not one, that can multitask. It's just them. And if they do, they're doing two bad tasks, let's face it. So they were kind of the things I learned. And I actually went out and proactively sought out a profile of how many women with this skill set can we get. Another thing that I think really generated revenue is, how do people have the resilience and grit to be in our profession, right? And we talked earlier about hiring the best people. And I think the best people were the ones that were maybe the first in their family to go to college, or I always used to hire A students from B schools, right? Because they had it tough. They had a rougher neighborhood to get through to get to be successful. And sales is a tough profession. It really is a lot of challenges, and 9 out of 10 times people say no. And, you got to have resilience and grit associated with that. And then I think, for me, there was also the types of profile of reps and how do they work well in different organizations. And then, so how do you hire reps that you want to fit your culture, right? So in that early stage, you probably want those lone wolf reps that just use all the resources, but they get the deal done and there's all fire and brimstone behind them. They probably wouldn't work as well in today's world because, as we talked about, you need that support and service. And another one too, is we interviewed, I think it was Cisco's first head of customer success that invented customer success at Cisco, big giant company. And, you think about how do you take care of, we talked about this, taking care of the deals you do sell. I mean, that's kind of the one thing I've always talked about. You got to take care of those customers, because I have examples in the book of, I sold to this individual when he was at Bristol Myers. Then he went to Pillsbury and I sold him there. Then they got bought by Diageo. I sold him there. So Alex bought software from me 3 times. It was almost too easy, right? But I built that relationship, stayed with that relationship. And so I think those are things too, in that, after the sale, this sport is forever. So you may sell somebody who's at company A, and if you piss them off or you don't treat them well, they're going to go to company B, and chances are they may buy your stuff. Yeah. Not increase revenue because they're not going to buy it. So I think there's some of the things that, probably very simple things that we learned through these titans of industry that I think had a lot of impact. So hiring the right people, having the right people that have the grit and determination to get through, and having that resilience. And, I think that's it. The other one was maybe the chapter on like having the EQ, creativity, because in complex deals, you have your playbook. And by the way, this is not a playbook, right? We didn't intend it to be, but we wanted it to be a guide to make sure you're doing all things right. And these are areas you should work on. And the whole, EQ versus IQ, there's a lot of really smart people, but can they go into the trenches and get creative and get stuff done, and master that sales process in these, especially larger, more complex deals. So I think there's some of the things that as you go through the chapters, it really makes, all the difference, and it really, generates revenue. And I got people to call me and tell me, I read the book, I gave it to all my reps. They all had something that they learned, through the process, and they changed some form or fact of behavior because of it. Or for some of the more experienced folks, it was a great refresher, and they say, you know what, I got a little stale, because I see a lot of folks that are more experienced, they kind of get lazy and lose their fastball, and then that's not a good thing in the long runs. But if you read the book, you'll have an ability to go through all those things, and I'd be happy to answer any of your, hosts or folks that are interested, answer any of their questions.
Perfect. Empathy is so key, Paul, and you talked about it. It's part of the book as well. And so far, we're still selling software to humans on the other side. at least right now. That may change in future. We might have AI agents buying software in future, but right now we still have humans mostly buying software. So empathy is so key to not just that sale process, but like taking care of customers afterwards. Last thing, and then I'll close it out. If you had to write the book today, what chapter would you add for 2025?
Yeah, that's a good one too, because it's interesting. I thought about this where, okay, if I have to go rewrite, I wouldn't rewrite a lot, but what would I add, right? And two things really happened since we took the book out. So maybe 2 chapters, right? One was COVID, right? And I think COVID changed the selling process, right? We had Zoom before that, but Zoom went crazy. DocuSign went crazy. Why? Because people figured out a way to build relationships different ways, right? So how do you change the way you've built a relationship in the past, which in the past was a lot of face-to-face, a lot of time spent with the customer or prospect, one-on-one or in a group through this process, consultative process. Now, all of a sudden, with not even just COVID, obviously even now, post-COVID, people don't want to see people. Yeah, just let's set up a Zoom. Call me on the phone. I don't want to fly to, a 30-minute or an hour meeting. So I think that's what I would kind of work on is how does this change, the selling motion change post-COVID, right? And then obviously the AI component, there was AI, I was sitting on the board of a AI company, but it wasn't AI today, right? It was old school natural language processing and kind of non-gen. And now you got these agents that are going to do, you mentioned buying. I'm talking to a company now where we're looking at procurement where it's going to be an agent that does the buying because you can't keep procurement people in a big company or even a small company to buy stuff. No, the same thing on sales. A lot of the sales activity can be done by an agent. So to see how that will change the buying and selling motion, specifically with technology, right? With consumer goods and all that, it's more the Amazon approach than B2C. But in the B2B world, I'm telling you, there are going to be, new ways of doing outreach and SDRs, and a lot of those jobs will probably be done by agents on both the buying and the selling side. So that's probably another whole book, not a chapter. But it's really an exciting time to watch our business evolve and how quickly it's going to evolve with AI. And yeah, we are in a hype cycle, but it's not going away.
Well, that's the mic drop comment we were looking for closing out this episode. So thank you so much, Paul. This was outstanding. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure our listeners learned a ton. Where can people follow your work?
Okay, well, I am at paul@stripes.co.com, stripes.co. And just go on Amazon, give me a good review if you like it. If you don't like it, just don't give me a review at all.
Awesome. Well, folks, thank you so much for hanging out here on Hold the Churn. If you like this episode, review it, share it, and go buy Paul's book, Selling the Cloud, and give him a review on Amazon.
Thank you, Sandra. It's always a pleasure to see and talk to you. Keep up the great work. You're doing amazing.